Perfect. And we started. Good morning, Bruno.
Hey Nick, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks, and you.
Good.
Good.
Cool.
Another episode of PLA.
Yeah,
Just us today. And
yeah,
I think you got one question for me to start.
yeah. So let's start with yours. So this is probably going to be what our second last episode, I would imagine, for the year.
For the year.
But yeah, it's been it's definitely been a good year.
Yeah.
So the first question comes from somebody that approached my office with this question. It's regarding early termination in terms of the Consumer Protection Act. So it's a standard lease agreement, makes provision for fixed term 12 months. Now, the fixed term was lapsing at the end of December this year, and early termination was given at the beginning of November of this year in terms of the CPA. So as it stands at the moment, there was early termination. The month of November had been paid, and now the question always comes up between landlord and tenant, going, well, is the deposit going to be refunded? From the landlord's perspective, the property hasn't been occupied. Attempts have been made to find occupiers, but there hasn't been any occupiers. So more likely than not, there's only going to be an occupier at the beginning of January, although the landlord is attempting to find someone in the meantime. On the tenant side, the tenant is saying that he expects to receive the deposit back. And the fact that the property is not yet tenanted is inconsequential. So maybe just on that note, give me your thoughts.
Perfect. So just to go back to the basics on a question like this. So Consumer Protection Act, Section 14 entitles a user of a service to terminate a fixed term agreement with 20 business days notice. Okay, that's a right that they're giving in terms of legislation. They have to give 20 business days written notice. And the caveat to canceling a fixed term agreement early by the consumer is that if they do this and they cancel the contract early, they are subject to what is described as a reasonable cancellation penalty in terms of legislation. Okay, so you can't just cancel your contracts early and expect it not to be any consequences as a result of that. You can be subjected to a reasonable cancellation penalty. Okay, as a result of that early cancellation. Now, in terms of a lease agreement, a deposit is obviously paid on behalf of the tenant to the landlord to cover any expenses that may be liable by the tenant to the landlord in terms of that particular lease agreement. Okay, and this is governed by the Rental Housing Act in the circumstances. Okay, so it's to cover anything that the landlord might suffer as a result of the tenant. So while we understand deposits a lot of the time to sort of go towards reinstatement of a premises. This is something that people normally associate with the deposit, to reinstate the premises afterwards if it needs painting or some things need fixing. That's not the full scope of the deposit. The deposit can be used towards any single debt which is owing. Okay. And so if at the end of a particular lease agreement it's come to an end, there is rental which is outstanding, the deposit can be appropriated towards that. Or for your commercial entities, there's something like operating costs. It can be appropriated towards that. It's any debt which might be owing from the tenant to the landlord in the circumstances. And if we follow that train of thought, this is still a debt. The cancellation penalty is still something that is now owing by the tenant to the landlord in terms of the lease agreement. So if the landlord is still holding a deposit and there isn't a premature cancellation, that penalty can be taken out of the deposit that's being held by the landlord. Just with regards to reasonability, the Act just says a reasonable cancellation penalty. So that's going to depend on the facts of the particular case. So there are some questions about, well, how much deposit are you holding? How many months are left on the lease agreement, and what's reasonable? But insofar as the question goes, can that deposit be used towards a reasonable cancellation penalty? Absolutely. It's a debt owing by the tenant to the landlord like any other.
Sure. Absolutely. Thanks for that, Nick.